Michael, welcome to the virtual CMO podcast. I'm so glad you could join us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, this is great because as our listeners know, this season we are doing a Masterclass Series all around this idea of building out a strategic marketing plan for your business. And in previous episodes, we've covered out the purpose behind building that plan, the target market, your ideal customer profile, product market fit, and competitive differentiation, all of those building blocks to help you understand how you want to market your product and service. And I'm really excited today that we can talk with you about this idea of building a brand story that resonates with your target customer. So for our audience who might not be familiar with you, if you could just take a few minutes and give us a little bit of your background, that would be great.
Sure. Well, never ask a professor to tell you what he does because it'll take an hour or two. But yeah, I'm a professor of marketing at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. I'm a consumer psychologist, and I've been studying consumer behavior for a lot of years. And I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of companies, with a lot of brands to make them more consumer-centric. So basically what I focus on is looking at what we call the deep meanings of brands. And, the idea, I guess my mantra is we don't buy things because of their functionality, because of what they do. We buy them because of what they mean. And that's where your brand story comes in. It's so important. Time after time, as I've worked in different verticals, I've seen that many, and managers hate to hear this, but consumers think that most of the competing brands are pretty much the same. Every manager or owner hates to hear that. But there's always one or two that kind of stand out from the rest, your Apples, your Nikes, the usual suspects. And so what I focus on is really looking at the brands that successfully tell a story, and a story that people want to hear, a story that people want to participate in telling. And that is, as you're focusing in this masterclass on strategic planning and competitive differentiation, that is usually the single biggest differentiator. So that's what I do in the process. I'm a textbook author. My book on consumer behavior is very widely used in business schools. And I love to do keynotes and talk about why brands are so important to us and the roles they play in our lives.
I love the mantra that you just talked about, and I really want to dive into that a little bit more. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned something else that was something we talked about a little on the previous show, which is this idea that there aren't that many revolutionary products out there. Most products are just incremental improvements or changes to what's out there. Do you see this a lot when you're talking with companies? You mentioned the fact that a lot of founders, CEOs tend to think that their product or service is so unique and different, but it's not really true, is it?
It's usually not true. There are glaring exceptions, and those are the real success stories that podcast hosts love to talk about, and actually sometimes, the revolution is not in the functionality of the product, because like you say, it's usually an incremental improvement. But sometimes the revolution is actually sparked by the users of the product, and they're the ones who not only come up with new uses for a product, they come up with new meanings for a product. We can talk about examples of that if you'd like, but one of the most important developments today is that your brand is not something that you create and own. It's actually co-created and co-owned by your customers. And a lot of business people have trouble accepting that idea. But in today's, Wild West internet world where anybody can post whatever they want, you have to really keep your ear to the ground and see what your customers are doing that's revolutionary with your brand.
That's interesting that you talked about, because in the pre-call, we were talking a little bit about something that Walmart did over the holiday season with TikTok, where they actually did a virtual fashion show with influencers, and influencers are something relatively new in marketing. I think, we used to call them brand advocates, but it's changed its terminology a little bit and what that means. But is that the kind of thing that you're talking about with consumers really owning the brand a little bit more?
Yeah, well, that's certainly part of it. And everybody's talking about influencers. In fact, some people are saying that their day is already over. Certainly the pandemic has taken the bloom off the rose of some of those influencers. To some extent, it's old wine in new bottles, like you said. Brand ambassadors, influencers, opinion leaders over the years, but the basic idea is that everyday people are today much more proactive in terms of how they relate to brands. And what that means is that they often take a brand and they change the meaning of it so that it actually, in some cases, it expands to a new market. If I can give you a quick example that comes to mind.
Please do.
You take a brand like Timberland, right? So everybody knows Timberland. It's a great outdoor brand. It's all about the wilderness and being at one with nature, et cetera, et cetera. And when you see the ads for Timberland, traditionally, it's young Caucasians, very happy and healthy out in the woods somewhere, or climbing a glacier or something. And then a few years ago, what happened was you had some, I guess we'll call them influencers in the African American community that actually took that brand and, if you will, hijacked it. And this happens a lot, what I call brand hijacking, where some of these people who were concentrated in urban areas, really never had the opportunity to go out to national parks and stuff, started to wear the clothing and especially the shoes, and it became actually part of hip hop subculture. And so you started to see a lot of music videos and things like this, not necessarily sponsored by Timberland, but what that means is, so they're essentially, these people are, I think, my theory is they were making an ironic statement by saying, I'm the last person you'd ever see out hiking in the wilderness, because my domain is the urban jungle, so to speak.
Right.
But so I'm going to make this ironic statement, and in the process, this opened up an entire new market for this brand, and it wasn't something, to the best of my knowledge, that they instigated at all. But they were smart enough to kind of take the pulse of who was wearing it and what they were doing with it. And that creates new opportunities. So there are many examples of that, certainly in the fashion area, but even in B2B settings, which, and I know you do most of your work there.
Yes.
If you look at the so-called boring place, industries like chemicals and things like that, I'm showing my bias because I usually work in B2C. If you look at something like the chemical industry, according to research I've seen, about 70% of the new product ideas in that industry came from the customers of those chemical companies.
Interesting.
And there's similar findings, in a variety of engineering, aviation and so on. It's the customers who are living with that product and are now putting their own stamp on it. So it's not that they've entirely taken it over, but they are co-owners in the sense that after you release it, or sometimes before you release it, in the case of, say, Legos or somebody like that, they do a great job of that. These are companies that are not afraid to give their customers a peek under the kimono and not wait to release a brand or product before it's absolutely perfect. And that's one of the biggest changes we see. Now, there are, the biggest exception there is Apple, because they're famously secretive about leaks. But they're the exception that proves the rule. And so really this revolution in thinking, I believe, started with software, because this notion of beta testing, and getting your users to find the bugs in the program before you launch it, before you launch that code. I mean, that's been an enormous game changer for companies like Microsoft. And so your listeners, you can adopt that perspective, I think, by not keeping your customers at a distance, but rather by acknowledging and welcoming them to be part of your development team and part of your sales force. And in general, what we find is that whenever people have the opportunity to be literally involved in creating what they buy, their level of engagement with that brand goes through the roof. Actually, we call that the IKEA effect. Sometimes, because of everybody has to build all the bookshelves and things like that.
Right,
and
right.
like the joke that whenever I've done that, I always have like 5 pieces left over. I don't know what they are, but what I always like, say is like, if I build a bookshelf, every time I look at that bookshelf, I'm not just seeing a bookshelf, I'm seeing my own sweat and labor that went into that. And so my level of engagement with that is much, much bigger than it would be with just a boring bookshelf. And no matter what product or service you're into, I think you could probably identify some parallels that can be very powerful.
You said a couple interesting things. I want to drill down on one of them. And I find this a lot when I'm dealing with founders of companies, CEOs, is that they get very sort of single-minded in their vision of what their product or service is or does. And in fact, there may be data sitting right in front of them that says customers are using this product in a slightly different way. If you would exploit that, you may have a whole new source of revenue or a whole new direction for this product. And oftentimes they're saying, well, yeah, but I don't want to put all my eggs in that basket. But I think your point is so well taken, is that sometimes customers can literally be your best resource in product development or market research to say, hey, we can take this product in another direction that maybe we never even thought of.
Absolutely. And, sometimes it takes a while for this to sink in. Maybe if I could share a quick story with you one of my favorites, it's a little dated now, but some of your viewers may remember the movie Office Space. It was kind of a cult hit, about
very much so,
some crazy. And there was one guy in particular, the guy, I forget his name, but he, the one that they put in the basement, they were always trying to get rid of him. He was a really weird guy, and he had this red stapler that he used. It was a pretty big, it was pretty big in the plot of the movie, and he was very jealous of very guarded about this red stapler, and there was no such thing as a red stapler. It was actually a Swingline stapler, common gray stapler, and some prop guy, when they were filming the movie, had the idea to spray paint it red. Okay. Well, Swingline starts, when the movie starts to become a cult hit, Swingline starts getting emails, from customers saying, "Where can I buy that red stapler that the guy had?"
That the guy had in the movie?
Well, they didn't make one. Well, 2 years afterwards, Swingline came out with a red stapler. So, it was a mixed bag. It took them a long time to figure it out, but they eventually figured out, what, people are asking us for something we don't make, but we know that there's demand there because they're asking us. And so they finally, it's like turning a battleship, but with a big company. But kudos to them for finally figuring it out. And that red stapler flew off the shelves because people identified it with it so strongly. So when your customers start making suggestions to you, I'm not saying you should follow every one. Some of them are going to be off the wall, but listen to them carefully. And when you talk about data that's, right under your nose, your employees are often the best source of marketing research that you have. And it's free, unless you incentivize them, which I think you should, because they're in the trenches every day. They're interacting with customers. They're hearing their objections, et cetera. And yet when it comes time to, let's say, develop next year's line, how many companies actually go to their sales force or to their top salespeople and say, hey, what are you seeing? And it's right there,
Yes. Yeah, there's good intelligence that's right in the company and may not even be used. I want to talk about something that you mentioned in your book, and let me make sure I've got the quote right, but you talk about how marketers sell vertically, but consumers buy horizontally. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that? I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, I'll try to explain quickly. So basically, no matter what business you're in a vertical, right? We refer to it as a vertical. And when you benchmark your performance, when you come up with new product ideas, you're always looking at your most immediate competition. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's a very, very myopic view, because consumers don't care about your competitors. They don't care about your market share. Consumers are buying horizontally. And what I mean by that is they are looking across verticals. So if you can imagine, I don't have a blackboard or anything here, but if you can imagine a bunch of verticals, and let's say it's a living room, okay? We have lamps, we have tables, we have carpet, whatever we have, all the knickknacks, the things that go into a living room. So if you're a lamp manufacturer, you're benchmarking directly against other lamps. But for me as a consumer, I'm looking for a lamp that is complementary to what I've bought in other verticals. Like, does it go with that couch? Does it go with that table, etc.? So that's what I mean by horizontal buying, which is that what we're doing is we're constantly assembling what I call a constellation of products that go together because in our minds they go together. So when you think about a constellation up in the sky, right? The ancient Greeks looked up in the sky and they see these random stars up there, but our brains don't see them as random. The way we're wired psychologically is that our brains are looking for patterns and connections. And so what was a random collection of stars becomes the Big Dipper, right? And then there's a story about the Big Dipper that people tell. Well, in the same way, when we see some brands together, we assume that there will be other brands that go with that, because the media, there's a lot of influences on this, but let's, one of my favorite examples, hopefully some of your listeners are old enough to remember the Yuppie, right? I don't know if you're
the Yuppie. Yeah, that's right.
But how do we define the Yuppie, if there ever was such a thing? We define the Yuppie largely in terms of what he or she owned, and it wasn't just in one category. It was a Rolex. It was playing squash. It was Burberry and Brooks Brothers and Brie and white wine and on and on. So you'll notice, if I give people that descriptor, if I say, here's a person who actually uses these, we've done a kind of an inventory check of what they're using. A lot of people would say, oh, that's a Yuppie. And that makes perfect sense to consumers, because no matter what your social identity is, there's a lot of things that go along with that. So music is a great example. If you look, and actually years ago, I did some work back when MTV used to really show music videos. I did some work with them, and we actually showed music videos to people, to kids, both here and in Scandinavia, with the sound, music videos they had never seen before, with the sound off. And we asked them to tell us what genre of music was playing in that video.
Oh, interesting.
And as you can imagine, they were just about 100% accurate without even hearing the music, just by seeing who the people were, what products they were holding up, a bottle of liquor or something like that. They were able to say, oh, that's rock, that's country, that's hip hop, what have you, because they are looking horizontally. And so strategically, I can't tell you how important that is. It can be as simple as going to a clothing store like Nordstrom and buying let's say you go to a Nordstrom, you're obviously a snappy dresser. I appreciate that. You go to Nordstrom and you buy a shirt. Well, if you're a really good salesperson, what should you do? You should march you over, or the salesperson should march you over to the jacket, to the blazer section, or the suit section, or the tie section. And we call that upselling, right?
Right.
But what it means is, how often do you walk into a clothing store and you see a mannequin wearing an entire outfit,
right,
that someone has put together? Not very often, and I'm not just talking about a shirt and a tie. I'm talking about accessories. I'm talking about shoes, maybe a briefcase. That's a very powerful way to merchandise, right? Because it's going horizontal across, the tie maker may not be the same as the shirt maker, but they certainly have a lot of synergy together. So when you see even joint promotions, like I remember Louis Vuitton, they had a leather version of, I want to say it was a Mercedes, I think it was a Lexus actually, where so you buy the Lexus and you get these leather seats and that are made by Louis Vuitton. Now, that's not rocket science, but it's two very different verticals, leather goods and automotive. I mean, come on, what do they have to do with one another? Right. Well, it turns out a tremendous amount, because the same person who buys a Lexus is likely to, to buy that quality of leather. and on and on and on. So, I would encourage your viewers to really come up out of their vertical sometimes and ask themselves, what are, when people buy my product, what else are they buying with it? And you can, at the least, you can find some very interesting cross-licensing, cross-merchandising opportunities, because you're not just looking at functionality. Like, if I'm a lamp manufacturer, like I was saying before, yeah, I can go to GE and say, hey, we should partner because you make light bulbs that go in my lamp. Well, that's great. But I should also go to that couch company and say, hey, we can coordinate an entire, and it's like you go to IKEA, which I'm mentioning again, I'm not working for IKEA, but sometimes, they will do this. They'll have an entire, say, a kid's bedroom.
Yes. Set
right.
up.
It's got everything set up. Or, there's a company, I don't know if they're still around, called Rooms to Go, where,
Yep.
You basically order a whole room. I think a lot of guys who got divorced and were thrown out of their houses would buy, Rooms to Go, because they could get a whole room delivered. That kind of horizontal marketing is very rare, but I can't stress enough how powerful it is, because it's a reminder of the more basic principle that I'm really pounding on here, which is walk a mile in your customer's shoes. Don't sit in your office and assume that you understand what your customer does. And furthermore, another corollary to that, and I've seen this in my own work many times, many managers cater or think about the customer they want to have,
yes,
rather than the customer they actually have.
Oh yeah.
So in fashion, or other products like that, everybody wants to go after the affluent, 30-year-old
Sure.
urban woman, let's say. But in fact, your customer may be a 50-year-old woman who lives in the heartland somewhere. But everybody's got this notion, which is why, for example, older people are largely ignored in television advertising, even though they spend much more money than younger people do. Somehow, as I've gotten older,
sexy, right?
Yeah. And as I've gotten older, somehow that problem seems more of a big deal to me. I don't know why.
Well, what's interesting, just to add on to your example, you were talking about Rooms to Go. I actually had an email from them the other day where they wanted to create a virtual background for me to be able to use on Zoom calls, but obviously it would be all of their furnishings and whatnot that would be in this. So you could create a virtual room using their furnishings, and they would do this for free.
Love it. I love it. That is great. Kudos to them.
Yeah, it's creative and it's taking advantage of the circumstances that exist right now. And, everything that you're saying really, to me, comes together around this idea of creating a story for your brand, right?
Right.
You don't just have a product or a service. You have a product or service that fits into a business or a person's life in some way. And part of the story that you're trying to create is, how can your product or service fit into the workings of a business or the workings of somebody's life in a way that adds value and changes it. So, who do you think are some examples out there that you think have really created a fantastic brand story? We're in this age right now where everything is so visual, right? We've all got cameras in our pockets. We've got YouTube and Instagram and all these channels. And I see brands taking advantage of this in ways that are largely different than before. There were newspapers and magazines and radios and things like that. But today you can create such an immersive experience for your brand to really tell that story. Are there some that come to mind to you that think did an excellent job?
That's a great question. There's a lot of ways to answer it. One way first of all, there was a famous marketing researcher named William Shakespeare. And William Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage.
Yes. And
that perspective, we call that the dramaturgical perspective on marketing. I've written about that a lot. And what it means is that we are actually like attending a play when we think about a lot of these situations where we have actors that are expected to say certain things. We have props, we have settings, and all of that is so crucial. So to answer your question, one thing to do is to look at some celebrities and how they've reinvented themselves. My favorite personally is Ralph Lauren.
Yes.
And what I love about Ralph Lauren is, I mean, he's does great work, et cetera. But when you think about his brand story, and everybody can probably visualize it, you think of, maybe you think of this beautiful blonde, kind of waspy couple walking on the beach in the Hamptons in white linen with their sheepdogs running around, so it's that kind of
so
that
true. It's exactly
right?
the image I get. Yeah.
But when you look at him, so, he literally reinvented himself. So his real name is, I don't think it's a secret, is Ralph Lifshitz.
Yes. He's
the son of a Jewish house painter from Brooklyn. And not many of his customers know that.
Right.
So
it doesn't roll off the tongue quite the same.
Yeah. And so he, at some point, has invented himself in the same way we might say Kim Kardashian has invented herself. That's a whole different brand story, I guess.
Right.
But this happens a lot with celebrities just by changing their name. Martha Stewart has got a certain image. Maybe it involves going to jail, but for a lot of people, it's a different image. But she's the daughter of Polish immigrants. She reinvented herself, and you can go on and on and on. Even just taking a stage name, as many singers and actors and other people do, is part of a way to reinvent yourself. And the point is that once you create that story, if people buy into that, then that story is, again, co-created by the consumers of that. And so you think of fandom, for example, if you know that term, it would, people who are just incredibly passionate about let's say a TV show like Lost or something like that.
Yep.
So you think about Star Trek, right? So you've got obviously a huge, to this day, even though it hasn't been on for a long time, this huge community of people, like, the ones who dress up and go to these conventions and stuff. But you've also got several really well done Star Trek movies that were done by fans of Star Trek. So they were written by people who were just, crazy about Star Trek. Some of them actually star some of the, people who appeared in minor roles in the original Star Trek. And so you continue to have this community, and you could say the same for Star Wars and many other franchises like that. Disney understands this very well, and on and on. Yeah.
And I think, some of the examples you gave are so good, because if you take a brand like a Ralph Lauren or something like that, you can visualize it. And then that extends to the displays in the stores, or the packaging, or the advertising, or the website. That story comes through. And sure, when you're selling a brand like that, maybe that's a little easier to create a story around versus a chemical company or something along those lines. But, there are ways to, say that we're an environmentally conscious company, for example. We're doing things in a way that is safe for the environment. Or what is the sock company, I think, that says, for every pair of socks that you buy, we donate a pair of socks, to homeless shelters or something like that. There are ways to create a story around your brand, really, no matter what it is you're selling. But so many brands really don't take the opportunity to do that. They're so product centric that you really don't have any idea what they stand for or how those products fit into your culture or your likes or dislikes.
Yeah, you nailed it. And, if I can suggest to your listeners a quick exercise, I've done this many times. Sit down, if you're the owner or the president, whatever, sit down with, I don't know, 3 or 4 of your top people, and ideally a few of your top customers, and give each one a very simple assignment, which is imagine that one day your brand comes to life as a person, and you wake up one morning and your brand is sitting on the edge of your bed and wants to say hello to you. All right. Write me a paragraph or 2 and describe that person as specifically as you can. Gender, age, what music do they like to listen to? What are they wearing? What do they like to eat? Whatever comes to mind. And then look at everybody. So everybody has to do that on their own. And then look at everybody's descriptions. So on the one hand, if everybody aligns really well, that tells you something about the solidity of your brand story. Now, if your customers write a description that's very different than your managers wrote, that's a red flag, right? Because it means that the message you think you're communicating, the story you think you're telling, is not the story that people are hearing. And so regardless of the outcome, and I'm not saying, this is not a scientifically valid approach, based on what a few people say, but it can really be eye-opening. And what I like to, and I've done this sometimes when I've given keynotes and or seminars, and some managers look at me like I'm from Mars. And what I say to them is, if you can't form an image at all, if you can't relate to this assignment, you have a very serious problem, because it means that your brand doesn't have an identity, even in your mind, compared to the competition. You're somewhere in limbo. And imagine if you can't come up with the story, why would you expect your customers to come up with a story? So for what it's worth.
No, I think that's a great exercise and a very valuable one. I'm going to make sure we highlight that in the show notes, because I think, being able to visualize that's so important. And it's actually a pretty good segue to the next question I wanted to delve into a little bit, which is how important is an emotional connection when you create this brand story versus, facts and statistics and features and whatnot, especially in this day and age, how important is it really to establish that emotional connection?
Well, how can I answer that? The short answer is unbelievably important.
Mm-hmm.
The slightly longer answer is, it took the marketing discipline, and I'm including academics, researchers who do work in this area. It took a really long time, several decades, for many of them to figure out that people don't want facts. And I'm not saying facts aren't relevant, but if you look at the way our brains are organized, basically, we evolved from reptiles, right? And you can it's like a tree when you can look at the rings in the tree to see how it's grown. The initial reaction that we have to any stimulus is an emotional reaction. It's something that's formed in the limbic system of the brain. And so what we really need to do is to create that emotional response, which typically then triggers a desire to justify that response. So you want to make people feel good about your brand. You want to arouse the proper emotions, which is a motivator for them to then tune in and say, why did I feel so great about that? And that's where they often, it's like trying to, to someone who's, let's say, really into sports cars.
Mm-hmm.
You say to them, oh, well, they say, oh, well, I just, this Corvette, 68 Corvette or whatever just speaks to me, I love it and blah, blah. And then when you get into asking them why, they start giving you answers like about the displacement ratio. I don't even know, the torque in the engine and stuff like that. Come on, that's not why they want that Corvette.
Right, right.
They may or may not admit it to themselves, but it's purely an emotional reaction. And so it's not just, it's big ticket items as well that often have this reaction, like buying a house, And so to the extent that you can engage memories, emotions. So for example, they used to say, I don't know if they do anymore in the real estate business, one way to sell a house is to have huge doorknobs, handles on the front door. And the reason is that when people open it, their hands feel smaller, and it reminds them of when they were little and they grew up in their own house. It reminds them of opening the door.
Oh, interesting.
And you also want to have the smell of fresh baked bread or something in the oven, right?
Yeah. So
even for this very expensive purchase, not just a bauble or a shirt or something like that, I can't overplay the importance of that emotional response. Again, I'm not saying you can abandon facts, because especially with B2B products, but even there, you have these kind of irrational attachments, and I'm sure you could speak to this better than I can, but it may be that, you've got 5 different competitors that are selling you, I don't know, office supplies, but you have a relationship with a rep of company A, and you'll buy whatever she tells you to buy.
Yes.
Right. And it has very little to do with whether her pencils are better than the other guy's pencils.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I think the whole car industry is based on emotional connection, right? You know, what's the difference between a Kia and a Mercedes, right? They both have four wheels that get you where you want to go.
Exactly.
They may even have similar technology. And sure, you can argue that maybe there's better engineering or better features or whatnot, but it's that emotional connection that drives the huge difference in price and the reason that some people are willing to pay it versus some who aren't, because it's all about that emotional connection. And rarely in the advertisements do they go feature by feature and walk through what's on the window sticker, right? They may highlight a thing or two, but it's still about building that emotional connection.
Absolutely. And again, you know, it shows you that in so many verticals, I'm sure, for example, a car aficionado is probably not going to like what I'm going to say, but it's not that, you know, some cars definitely perform better than others, but there's a minimum level where nowadays, even the cheapest cars are pretty good.
Yes.
In a sense, and I'm not talking about whether they're going to inspire envy as you drive down the road, but they're not going to break down very much. You know, and we could say that about computers and phones and many technical products, as well as household products. I mean, you know, these 5 dish detergents, they're all, you know, none of them are going to burn your hands off or do something really bad, but somebody's going to pay a premium, let's say, for the Method brand, because when they look at the really interesting and beautiful package of that Method, I don't know if you're familiar with the, you know, with the containers that they use.
Yes.
It actually has an aesthetic response for a very mundane product, and that helps to explain their success, for example.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating topic because it really makes a difference. You know, we haven't talked too much about a company like Apple because they're an overused example, but they're overused because they do so many things well, right? You know, Steve Jobs was famous for never wanting to get into the specifics of how fast his chips were and things like that, because he was selling other things. He was trying to make that emotional connection. It's, you know, this is just a topic I think we could spend hours on. But I also, as we're sort of getting near the end here, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about your new book that's coming out, because it's exciting to be able to have a book launch. And we're very close. When this episode comes out, I think the book will just be coming live. So tell me a little bit about the book. It's called The New Chameleons, correct?
Yes, The New Chameleons, How to Connect with Consumers Who Defy Categorization. And essentially what I'm talking about there is the reason I use the term chameleons is that that's what modern consumers are, in that we change, just like chameleons change their colors, you know, constantly. We are changing our identities very, very quickly. And each of us has multiple identities. So what that means is it opens a lot of opportunities for companies, but it also presents a lot of challenges, because we're all grounded in this idea of traditional market segmentation. And, you know, mea culpa, I teach my own MBA students this, which is, you know, the logic is that we can't be all things to all people. So we divide our market into these fairly large homogeneous segments, and we find products that will meet the needs of those people fairly well. So, you know, Henry Ford is famous for saying, you know, my customers can have any color car they want as long as it's black.
Right. I remember that.
And then General Motors came along, and they actually invented the concept of market segmentation, because they said, you know what, you know, actually, just in terms of income, some people, you know, can afford a car that's maybe got some bells and whistles and others can't. And so they came up with this notion of divisions, right? You know, so you've got Cadillac and you've got Chevrolet and you've got others in between. But today, each of us is more like a market of one. And we don't want to be placed in market segments. You know, whenever I say to someone, you know, if I say, oh, you're just a typical member of a market segment, you know, my student makes them crazy, you know, oh, you're a 22-year-old female who goes to school in an urban area, blah, blah, blah. So you're the same as every other 22-year-old, blah, blah, blah. Well,
Yeah.
they go out of their minds because they're very unique. And the odds are that they are, because they're sampling lots of different identities. So if I can use a food metaphor, it's kind of like in the old days, you would open a restaurant like an Italian vertical or a Chinese vertical or what have you. But today we're more like people who are eating at one of those huge international food buffets. I don't know if those will come back after COVID, but,
Yeah, good point.
you get the idea, where we want to take our plate and we want to put an egg roll on it, and then a taco, and on and on. That's the way we're grazers today. And so these traditional approaches to segmentation are not necessarily as valuable, especially when we have the technology that can literally create a market of one. And so, as I'm sure you know very well, let's say it's something like Facebook. You and I can be quite similar to one another, but based on our past behavior and so on, you might click on, let's say, a political ad in Facebook, and I might click on the same one, but we're getting slightly different messages.
Sure.
Based on, because you've been interested in the past in social justice issues, and I've been interested in the past in something else. And so the candidate is going to talk to you about one thing and talk to me about another. Well, you and I are each a market of one. And so the ability to personalize and customize our offerings, whether it's tech products or fashion products or services, that is what people are looking for today. So in the book, I talk a lot about some basic categories that everybody uses and we don't think about it, that are no longer valid. And so some examples are producers versus consumers, like we were talking about before. Yeah. Today, that isn't true. Consumers are producers. The whole gig economy is evidence of that. Online versus offline. Today, everybody's online and offline all day long. I know my students are, while they're listening to me, they're online, or even something as basic as male versus female, right? So our brains like to put people in categories. Oh, that's male versus female. Today, especially among younger people, the concept of gender is fundamentally being disrupted.
Yes.
And many people are, there's a lot of political controversies about this, but the point is that this creates new opportunities. If, let's say, you're a company that's traditionally made, let's say, female products, whatever that means, well, today you might have males that are more receptive to that. So
sure.
In the UK, for example, a high percentage of men wear cosmetics, and there are stores that sell like mascara. Right? There are men who wear man bags. Maybe their friends tease them about it, but they carry a man bag. Well, if you're a handbag manufacturer, you've suddenly discovered a new market if you're willing to abandon your very traditional but very strong assumption that you're either this or that, which is what segmentation encourages us to think about. So I talk about a number of those in the book, and I show a lot of examples of companies that have created new markets for themselves by actually letting chameleons out of their cages, because they're all escaping anyway. And that's how you create new opportunities.
We started out talking a little bit about influencers and what not. And I think there's a lot of that within that community, because it's fitting in by being different. And so everybody wants to fit in to a certain extent, but at the same point, they want to do it on their own terms. And it sounds like exactly what you're talking about. I will definitely have links to the book in the show notes so that people can find it when it's available to order. Michael, this has been a great conversation. I think brand stories are so important, and the examples that you shared with us today, I think, are very meaningful. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. It's been great for our listeners.
I really appreciate it, and I enjoyed it. I appreciate it.
Thank you again.
Yeah.